We're in the midst of a series called Out of Context, looking at some of the most well-known passages from the Bible that are regularly ripped from their context. And you can't do a series on Out of Context without addressing the granddaddy of them all. Do not judge, or you too will be judged. Part 5, Out of Context. Let's jump in. Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. These are arguably the most well-known and most quoted words of Jesus, and almost always they are ripped from their context and quoted in a way that Jesus, I don't think, intended. And you'll even hear people who are not followers of Jesus quoting these words. I'm a child of the 90s, and I can't hear Matthew 7 without thinking of Tupac Shakur and his song, "Only God Can Judge Me." And that is one of the ways that we take these words out of context and we make them to mean something that Jesus didn't intend. Now, Matthew Green is a British comedian, and he captures perfectly the mind games that I think we play with ourselves in order to take this text out of context and make it mean something other than what Jesus intended. Listen to what he has to say.
Did you hear about the private jets and the motorcades at COP26? Bet they're not all electric vehicles. Yeah. And all the oil companies that are there and the beef on the menus. Yeah. They're such hypocrites. I guess so. Isn't it great? What? Well, I was beginning to worry. About what? All this climate change stuff. I was beginning to worry it was a real problem, but now I can see the hypocrites. I don't need to care. But it is still a problem. They don't think so. They're literally at a massive meeting about it. Eating beef. Not all of them. Enough for me not to care. So because they're hypocrites, it's not a problem. Exactly. It's like when that Cummings bloke drove to Barnard Castle when he had COVID. I was like, if the rules don't apply to him, they don't apply to me. So what did you do? I went to see my grandma. And didn't she get COVID? Yes, and I miss her, but that's not the point. What's the point? I don't understand. That's the game. If you can prove someone's a hypocrite, you can just ignore them. I mean, yeah, I agree. Setting an example is really important, but it's not the only thing that matters. So speaks a hypocrite? But I mean, isn't everyone a hypocrite in some way or another? Yeah, it's great. I can ignore everybody if I want to. So I assume you don't vote for anyone then? No, I vote for the people who tell it like it is. But all of them are hypocrites. They don't pretend to be perfect. And anyway, it's the message, not the messenger. I think I've worked it out now. You just want to do what you want to do without caring about how it affects anybody else. At least I'm not a hypocrite.
That so perfectly captures what happens in our culture as it relates to these words of Jesus. Essentially, we say, well, unless somebody else is perfect, you don't have a right to speak into my life. And since none of us are perfect, well, nobody has a right to speak into my life, because at some level, we're all hypocrites. And Jesus is going to speak about hypocrisy in this passage we'll see in just a moment. But really, we take these words out of context because at the end of the day, we just don't want anybody telling us what to do. And Jesus says, well, don't judge or you too will be judged. And hey, they just seem to work so well together. But is that what Jesus is saying? Because when you look into the Gospels, you'll see Jesus telling his disciples things like this. If your brother sins against you, go and show him his fault. Or in Luke chapter 17, verse 3, if your brother sins, rebuke him. So apparently in the kingdom of Christ's disciples, sin is something that we name and address in relationship. So it's like, wait a second. If do not judge or you too will be judged, how do you hold that in tension with, hey, in the kingdom of Christ's disciples, we address sin, we confront sin. How do those two things fit together? And so we've got to dig in to Matthew chapter 7 and understand the context behind Jesus's words. And if you understand the literary context of Matthew 7, what you're going to find is that Matthew 5, 6, and 7 are a part of the Sermon on the Mount. And this is an image of the hillside along the Sea of Galilee where Jesus most likely gave that Sermon on the Mount. But at the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is speaking with his disciples. And they've left everything to come follow him. And Jesus is about to tell them, hey, if you're going to follow me, if you're going to live like I live, here are the things that you need to do. And before he launches into the heart of the sermon, he's going to say to them, I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, after Jesus says these words, he's going to launch into all of these different facets of life. He's going to talk about things like anger and lust and oaths and fasting and prayer. And as he discusses those things, he's going to first point out the conventional righteousness, like the typical religious teaching of the day, of the Pharisees, of the teachers of the law. But then he's going to go on to show how that conventional righteousness turns in on itself. It's a vicious cycle that doesn't actually realize the kind of transformation that God intended for us through the law and the prophets. And then he's going to go one step further and he's going to say, hey, if you're my disciple, you don't want to get caught in this vicious cycle. Here's how you need to live differently so that you reflect a righteousness that is deeper and surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. So this is what Jesus is going to do. And before we dig into the depths of that, we've got to understand that this passage about do not judge all hinges on the meaning of the word judge. And it is this Greek word krino, and it has a range of meaning. One of those is to separate or to make a distinction or to exercise judgment. There are just going to be times in our lives where we have to decide, is it this or is it that? Is this person trustworthy or not? Is this a good deal or is it not? In fact, sometimes when we have to make a decision and we don't have a lot of time to gather the pertinent information, we will say, I made a judgment call. I didn't have time to gather, so I just kind of had to go with my gut. I made a judgment call. And this is just part and parcel of living as a disciple of Jesus. We have to exercise judgment. We have to be wise about decision making. In fact, a few chapters later in Matthew, Jesus tells the disciples, I'm sending you out like sheep among wolves. Therefore, be as shrewd as snakes and as innocent as doves. We're going to have this capacity for discernment, for subtlety, and for nuance. And I think we all understand that exercising judgment is not the same as passing judgment. And that is the second meaning of this word krino, is to pass judgment or to condemn. Now, condemnation is different than looking at somebody's life and saying, yeah, I don't think that's good. I don't think that's the best. I think you might want to reconsider that. Condemnation is actually putting yourself almost in God's place to judge someone else as unworthy because there's something in their life that you find objectionable. And this kind of condemnation is so crippling. Dallas Willard says it this way: when we condemn another, we really communicate that he or she is, in some deep and just possibly irredeemable way, bad. Bad as a whole, and to be rejected. And I don't know if you have ever felt that sense of condemnation, but there are few things in human relationships that can leave you feeling as isolated and cut off from people as condemnation. And so Jesus is going to go on to give this famous illustration to express why his disciples are really not allowed to engage in condemnation. And he says, imagine that there's somebody who has a speck in their eye, and you want to help get this speck out of their eye. And when this word for speck, it really just means like a stalk or a small twig or even like a piece of chaff. It's something really, really small. And you want to help get it out. But the problem is you have this beam in your eye. And he's talking like a huge structural beam. And Jesus is actually being really funny here. His word picture would have made his audience laugh. You have to almost imagine somebody walking around with this giant log hanging out of their face, and every time they turn around, they're knocking people in the face and knocking stuff off shelves, and they're the one that wants to help you deal with this small issue in your life. And the point of this illustration is that you can't help somebody remove the speck in their eye because your vision is impaired. In other words, if you're engaging in condemnation, you are not seeing like Jesus sees. And this is deeply, deeply human. In fact, two scholars put it perfectly by saying this: human beings possess an inbred proclivity to mix ignorance of themselves with arrogance towards others. This is just so deep in us, to hold ourselves in the best possible light, but to view others in the worst possible light. And so if you succeed, it's because you got lucky. But if I succeed, it's because I worked hard. But if you fail, it's because you were irresponsible or you weren't ready for the opportunity. But if I fail, it's because someone was out to get me, or I just didn't catch the brakes. We just have this incredible double standard. And this is exactly what Jesus was exposing in this teaching about judgment. He goes on to say, "You hypocrite. First take the plank out of your own eye, and then you'll see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye." Now, this word hypocrite, it's the Greek word hypokrites, and it just means like a mask. It's a reference to acting. And in Jesus's day, this was not a word that has the same meaning that it does in our day. If you went to the theater, you saw an actor, you were really moved or compelled by the job that they did, you might say to them, "Wow, you are a phenomenal hypocrite." It's actually Jesus who is responsible for taking that word and giving it to us with the meaning that we now associate it with, as somebody who presents one thing to the world when in actuality, there's something else that's true behind the mask. And Jesus says, when you condemn other people, you are engaging in hypocrisy because you don't see like I see. And this was notorious in the religious culture that Jesus was a part of. In fact, Matthew 23 is pretty much wholly devoted to Jesus calling out the hypocrisy of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. And he says things like, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites. You're like whitewashed tombs on the outside, which look beautiful, but on the inside are full of dead men's bones and everything unclean." So what Jesus does in his teaching is he says, well, here's how the Pharisees and the teachers of the law do this. They condemn others. But the problem they run into, the vicious cycle that they get caught in, is that they're actually guilty of the same thing. And so what is the deeper righteousness that he's going to call his disciples to? It's going to be to deal with their own beam. First, confront what's broken in you. Now, earlier this year, my wife started working after school with first graders. And it was so funny. She would come home at the end of the day and I would say to her, "Babe, how was school today? How was it?" And she would say to me, "Oh my gosh, Brad, first graders, they're little informers. All day long, Miss Tricia, so-and-so said a bad word. Miss Tricia, so-and-so pushed so-and-so. Miss Tricia, this person was chewing gum when they weren't supposed to." And she just said, "I am so exhausted from like investigating who did what." And she, after a couple of weeks, she said, "I learned I just needed to say to them, thank you for telling me that. Now I need you to focus on you." And this is essentially what Jesus is saying. Hey, no. Don't get caught in the vicious cycle of condemning when you're guilty of the same thing. You focus on you. And there's a really interesting thing that happens when you sit with Jesus in the presence of your condemnation of others. And I mean that literally, that as followers of Jesus, sometimes we need to imagine ourselves sitting at a table across from Jesus, and we just plop our condemnation of others down on the table and look at Jesus and say, what do you make of this? And listen for what he has to say. Because most often, if we sit with the presence of Jesus and our condemnations, what we're going to discover is that our condemnation is usually a form of projection. In other words, the things that are broken inside of us that we don't want to have to deal with, that we want to evade, if we can just find fault in others, well, that's my exit ramp to have to deal with my own brokenness. And Jesus says, no. This is not how it works. First, you focus on yourself. Then you bring that condemnation to me and we sit together and you let me begin to heal your projections. And the more you engage this, the more you do this with Jesus, over time, you may eventually become the kind of person who is capable of confronting sin without condemning others. Because this is what Jesus does. If we look at John 8, he's with the woman who's caught in adultery, and it says that Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir," she said. "Then neither do I condemn you," Jesus declared. "Go now and leave your life of sin." See, he confronts, he addresses her sin, but he doesn't condemn her. I think this is such a delicate, fine line to walk, and it is so easy to get that wrong. And we probably need to see it done well. We need to see Jesus do this with us over and over and over before we possess the kind of maturity where we're capable of doing this with another person. I had the privilege as a very young person to be given the gift of seeing this in action in my life. So when I was 10 years old, I was in 5th grade in Mrs. Gooding's class. At the end of this particular school day, I was returning my yardstick to the front of the classroom because our group was done with our math work. And as I was returning the ruler to the front of the classroom, Mrs. Gooding was bent over at another student's desk, and I was behind her back, and I did what any self-respecting 10-year-old boy with a yardstick and a captive audience would do. I took the batter's stance. And I started taking these slow, deliberate practice swings at my teacher's backside, and all the class is giggling. And about the 3rd practice swing, I noticed in my peripheral vision Mr. Gibbons, the school principal, walk past our door. And then I saw his face kind of pop back in and look into the room and made eye contact with my soul. And Mr. Gibbons opened the door and he just said, "Mr. Nelson, a word." And I walked over and he said words that changed my life. He said to me, when I think of Brad Nelson, that's just not what I think of. And he sent me back to class. And for 2 months, I could not look that man in the eye. He had caught me red-handed. He had addressed, named, and confronted what I had done. But he didn't condemn me. In fact, he did the opposite. He called forth the goodness that he saw in me. And his words were like burning coals on my head. But he confronted without condemning. And when you see that, and you receive that again and again from Jesus, and you've done your work to focus on your own beam, to allow Jesus to heal your projections, you may possibly join Jesus in becoming the kind of person who's mature enough to confront without condemning. So there you have it. Do not judge, or you too will be judged in context. May this be true of you, may this be true of me, and may we walk out this text well in our lives.